The night my father was supposed to die, my stepmother posted beach selfies with champagne and hashtags. I was sitting outside the ICU trying to remember how to breathe when a stranger walked in, looked at my father, and whispered, "He saved my son's life." I didn't know who he was, but that moment changed everything. Hours before that, I was clutching a styrofoam coffee cup I hadn't sipped from sitting on a stiff wooden bench beneath the humming fluorescent lights of Vanderbilt's ICU waiting room. The hallway smelled like bleach and fear. Every once in a while, a nurse would walk by briskly and Croc's eyes forward, like they couldn't afford to look anyone in the waiting room too long in the eye. I don't blame them. I sat with my knees pulled up, hoodie zipped, trying to shrink inside myself. Dad was behind that wall, hooked up to machines tubes and IVs that beeped in a rhythm I'd memorized too well over the last 48 hours. The doctors said he was fading. His blood oxygen had dropped again. The transplant hadn't come. There was a finality in their voices they tried to code in empathy, but I heard it. I heard it loud and clear. I wasn't ready. I hadn't been ready since the moment the phone rang 3 nights ago. I was folding laundry in my apartment when the call came in from a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Claire Dalton?" the voice asked. "We need you to come in. Your father's condition has taken a turn." My throat closed. I hadn't spoken to him in months. I'd moved to Asheville 3 years ago, partly because of work, mostly because I needed space from everything. From my father, from my own guilt, from the weight of conversations we never had. He wasn't a bad man. He was just quiet, guarded. After my mom passed when I was 10, he shut down the part of himself that used to laugh. The part that took me camping, built me a rocking chair from pine wood scraps, sang Johnny Cash while making pancakes on Sundays. Then he remarried 3 years later. Too soon, I thought. Her name was Sharon. All pearls and perfect lipstick. I never liked her. She treated me like a burden she had to charm. And worse, my dad never noticed, or if he did, he didn't want to rock the boat. By the time I was 17, I started spending more nights at friends' houses than my own. We talked less and less. I left for college in Michigan. He barely called. When I did come home for holidays, it felt like being a guest in someone else's house. He tried sometimes. He left little notes on the fridge. "Drive safe. Your favorite cookies in the pantry." But I never let him in again. Not really. And now, here I was, at the edge of losing him, and I didn't know how to forgive either of us. The cup in my hand had gone cold. A tear slipped down the side of my cheek without permission. I wiped it quickly, glancing at the double doors like I expected them to open and deliver news I wasn't ready to hear. My stepmother had left hours ago. "There's nothing else we can do," she'd said with that breathy, faux gentle tone she used at funerals and fundraising dinners. Then she showed me her vacation book in Cancun with the girls. I stared at her, too stunned to speak. "It's what he would want," she insisted, pressing a glossy pink lip to my cheek. "He'd want me to be happy, Claire. He always said that." I didn't respond. I watched her leave in heels too high for a hospital. I hated her. Not in the messy, dramatic way of soap operas. Just in that low, dull ache you carry when someone has disappointed you too many times, and now you no longer expect anything else. I looked back at the wall separating me from my father and whispered, "Please don't leave like this." That's when I heard footsteps approaching behind me. Heavy, unhurried. I didn't turn around at first. Not until I heard the intake of breath beside me, sharper than it should have been for someone not in pain. I looked up. A man was standing there, maybe late 40s, maybe older. It was hard to tell in the dim hospital lighting. He had a worn leather jacket, calloused hands and eyes that looked like they'd seen every kind of weather. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking through the ICU glass window, at my father. "That's him," he murmured. I stood slowly. "I'm sorry. Do you know my father?" He nodded slowly, still staring. "He's the one who helped me. Years ago, my boy was sick, real sick. We couldn't afford the treatments. Your dad, he gave us the money, just wired it to the hospital. Never wanted to thank you. Never even left his name. But I never forgot his face." I blinked, stunned. "He never told me. He wouldn't have." The man finally looked at me. "Some people don't need to advertise their kindness." I didn't know what to say. My throat felt tight again, but for a different reason this time. The man pulled something from his coat pocket. A photo. A boy maybe 5 years old, smiling in a hospital bed, a toy dinosaur in his lap. "That's him?" the man said, pride in his voice. "He's 15 now, healthy as ever." I took the photo, hands shaking. "Why are you here?" "I saw the name on the donation wall in the children's wing," he said. "Then I heard about a man in ICU with the same name. I wasn't sure. But then I saw his face, and I knew." I stared at the photo, then back at the man. "He's dying," I whispered. "Maybe not," he said quietly. "What's wrong with him?" I told him. "Blood disorder. Rare. Needs a specific blood type for transfusion, AB negative. No one in the family matched." Time was running out. The man's eyes sharpened. "I'm AB negative." My breath caught. I looked at him, this complete stranger with weathered eyes and a voice full of quiet certainty, and for a second I wasn't sure I'd heard him right. "You're AB negative?" I asked, like the words needed to be repeated to make sense. He nodded slower this time. "Donated once before. I keep the card in my wallet." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn donor card, flipping it to show me the blood type. AB. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. "I need to tell the nurse," I said, half standing, the hope crashing over me too fast to carry alone. But even as I moved, my body hesitated, like it didn't know how to switch gears from helpless to hopeful. As if I didn't know how to believe this might be okay. And that made me think of something I hadn't let myself revisit in years, when I stopped believing things would be okay at all. I was 10 when my mom died. It was an aneurysm. One moment, we were picking out cupcakes at the grocery store for my class party, and the next she was on the floor, eyes wide open, but not seeing anything. I remember the sound of sirens, the smell of blood oranges in our grocery cart, the way my dad kept rubbing my shoulder like he could wake me up from the moment. After she died, the house felt like a museum of someone too good to let go. Her handwriting on recipe cards, her jacket hanging on the back of the door. For a while, Dad and I were a team grieving in quiet tandem. He made me breakfast every morning, packed notes in my lunch, and always checked that my nightlight was on. But he also stopped laughing. I miss that part the most. He used to sing old songs in the kitchen. The house got too still. When he met Susan, I was 12. She worked in real estate, wore perfect makeup, and smiled like every room had a camera in it. At first, I tried to like her. I thought maybe it'd bring a piece of him back. But then she started rearranging things. Literally. Took down my mom's photos from the hallway and replaced them with beige paintings of fruit bowls. She told me it was time to move forward. She brought me scented bath bombs and complimented my grades, but always made me feel like I was being monitored, like I was a potential problem she had to get ahead of. I could tell she adored how Dad treated her, how he seemed lighter again. And I hated that I resented her for it. I hated how fast everything changed. They got married the summer before high school. I didn't cry at the wedding, I just stood still in a pale blue dress Susan picked out, hands clasped, wishing my mom could see what was happening and maybe shake the sky a little. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling until the shadows started to look like moving water. It felt like I'd lost both parents, not just one. From then on, I kept a safe distance. I went to college out of state. When I visited, I stayed short, polite, presentable. I got used to the way Susan always forgot my favorite foods or told me I should smile more. Dad tried. I saw it in the way he offered to drive me back or how he slipped extra money into my coat pocket when no one was looking. But we stopped talking about real things. Our relationship became a sequence of shallow exchanges. Work okay? You need anything? Love you. The words were still there, but the warmth was rationed. After college, I took a job in Asheville. It was quiet, green, far. I thought space would help. I thought maybe Dad would reach out more, but neither of us did. Months would pass with only a text or two. When Susan posted birthday photos or updates on her curated life, I'd see him in the background, holding a drink, looking like a man out of place at his own party. Still, when the hospital called, I didn't hesitate. I dropped everything. I drove through the night with a duffel bag and a racing heart. And I'd been here ever since, watching machines breathe for him, wondering if the last thing he'd remember about me was the way I pulled away all those years ago. Now, standing next to this man, holding the flimsy hope of a matching blood type in my hand, all of it crashed over me. The resentment, the guilt, the years I'd wasted keeping score in a game no one was winning. I blinked quickly, shoving the thoughts back. I'll go find the nurse, I said. My voice cracked. He put a hand on my arm. I'll come with you. If it's a match. I want to do this. I nodded, and we moved together down the hallway. My footsteps felt uneven, like my body wasn't used to walking toward hope instead of away from pain. As we turned the corner, I glanced back at the ICU doors and whispered, "Don't go yet. I'm not finished." When we reached the nurse's station, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting the whole hallway in a kind of sterile haze. I introduced Ethan to the charge nurse, a woman named Marta, who had soft eyes and a clipboard she never seemed to put down. "He thinks he's a match," I said, my voice breaking somewhere between urgency and disbelief. Marta raised an eyebrow, but nodded quickly. "Come with me," she said, motioning for him to follow. "We'll need to verify that," she said, her voice calm but focused. "If he's in the registry, we can fast-track it. Otherwise, we'll start testing right now." I wanted to go too, to make sure he didn't vanish like some fever dream, but she waved me off gently. "Let us handle it. We'll update you soon." Ethan gave me a short nod, then followed Marta down the corridor, his boots echoing against the linoleum floor. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, feeling the weight of every decision, every moment that had led to this one. Then I turned and walked back toward my father's room. The ICU was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt too loaded to be peaceful. I stepped through the automatic doors, past the glass panels, and entered the space I'd been orbiting for days, but hadn't fully faced. My dad, Thomas Carter, lay in the center of a room humming with machines. His skin looked pale against the white sheets. His chest rose and fell with mechanical rhythm. A monitor beeped steadily at his side, counting seconds I couldn't afford to lose. I stood there, hands clenched at my sides, staring at the man who used to teach me how to tie knots, who carried me on his shoulders through the state fair when my feet got tired, who held my hand at my mother's funeral, even when his own eyes were red-rimmed and shaking. Now he was barely a breath, barely a whisper of the man I remembered. A nurse noticed me standing at the threshold and came over. She introduced herself as Rachel, her badge clipped to a soft blue cardigan. "You're Claire?" she asked gently. I nodded. She looked at me with the practiced compassion of someone who's had this conversation too many times. "We've been doing everything we can, but your father's condition is delicate. His blood disorder complicates things further." She paused, then added, "He has AB negative blood. It's rare, less than 1% of the population. We've been searching for a matching donor, but—" She trailed off. I didn't need her to finish the sentence. "I'm not a match," I said softly. "They tested me when I arrived." She nodded. "Your stepmother, too. No compatibility?" "Of course not." Sharon's most compatible match had always been with gold cards and people who laughed too loudly at her jokes. I felt a bitterness rise in my chest and forced it down. This wasn't the time. Rachel's hand hovered over mine for a second, a kind gesture that made me feel like a child again. Then she excused herself to check a monitor across the room. I sat down in the vinyl chair beside my father's bed, the same one I'd occupied for hours the night before and the night before that. I stared at his face, tracing the shape of his brow, the lines at the corner of his eyes that I used to think made him look tired, but now just made him look human. "They're trying," I whispered, as if he could hear me. "There might be a match. A man named Ethan. He said you helped him once." I paused. "I never knew that about you." I wanted him to open his eyes, to give me one of those small, tight smiles he used to save for quiet victories like fixing the porch swing with duct tape or cooking pancakes without burning them. But he didn't move. Only the machines answered. The door creaked behind me and I turned expecting a nurse, but it was someone else, a doctor in navy scrubs, clipboard in hand. He introduced himself as Dr. Lung, the attending physician. He looked young, too young, but his eyes carried a weariness that told me he'd lived too many long nights in rooms like this. "I wanted to talk with you, Claire," he said, pulling over a rolling stool and sitting across from me. "Your father's condition has remained stable, but that's more about the machines than his body. We're nearing the limits of what we can do without compatible blood. If a donor doesn't come through in the next 24 hours. He didn't say it, but I heard it again. The drop-off. The cliff's edge we were standing on. I told him about Ethan, about the donor card, about Marta walking him to get tested. Dr. Lung's expression shifted. A flicker of something like hope. "If he's a confirmed match and healthy enough to donate, we may have an option. We'd still need to move quickly." "I'll do whatever you need," I said. "I'll sign anything." He nodded and stood. "We'll keep you posted." When he left, I slumped back in the chair. I reached into my bag and pulled out the old Polaroid I kept in my wallet. Me on my dad's shoulders, 6 years old. Both of us smiling like we'd never be sad again. I stared at it until the edges blurred, until my eyes burned. I didn't know if this stranger could really save him. I didn't know if miracles came in denim jackets and calloused hands. But I was beginning to believe something I hadn't believed in. A long time, maybe people did show up when it mattered. Maybe I wasn't alone in this after all. I was still holding that thought when I heard the sound of heels clicking down the hallway. Too fast. Too loud for a place like this. And then came the perfume, sweet, artificial, over-applied, just like always. Susan. I turned my head as she appeared. Her beige trench coat belted tight at the waist, like she was stepping into a conference, not an ICU. Sunglasses on top of her head, a phone already in hand. She barely glanced at me. "Claire?" she said like a greeting she didn't want to give. "How's he doing?" "Unchanged," I replied. "They're still trying." She sighed like I'd told her a meeting got rescheduled. Then she pulled out her phone and started tapping the screen. "I had to move a couple things around to come back here." You know how hard it is to change flights last minute, she said, not looking up. I said nothing. I didn't trust my voice. She wandered into Dad's room, stood by the foot of his bed, and crossed her arms. For a second, her face softened. She reached out and gently touched the edge of the blanket, then immediately pulled her phone back out and took a photo. It's just for my prayer group, she said, without being asked. They like to stay updated. I looked away. I didn't want to explode. Not here. Not yet. A nurse walked by and smiled politely at Susan, who turned on her warmth like a stage light. Oh, yes, she gushed. The staff here have been incredible. We're just so grateful. Truly. Her voice was syrup. The nurse nodded and moved on. The second she was gone, Susan dropped into the visitor chair with a loud sigh, opened Instagram, and started scrolling. You know, if this goes on much longer, I'm going to have to cancel the villa, she muttered. Non-refundable, too. So annoying. I stared at her, stunned. He's dying, Susan. She didn't look up. You think I don't know that I've been here all week, haven't I? You left 2 days ago to go shopping in Nashville. Well, I can't help him, can I? She snapped, then caught herself and softened her tone. Sweetheart, I know this is hard, but there's nothing we can do now. He's not going to make it. We should start thinking about what comes next. She said it like she was talking about rearranging furniture. I stood up. I need some air. Take your time, she said. I'll hold the fort. As I walked out, I heard her voice float after me, half whispered to someone on the phone. He'll be gone soon anyway. Might as well enjoy my life. I froze in the hallway. There it was. The truth she'd been tiptoeing around for years, and now she wasn't even bothering to hide it. I leaned against the wall, eyes burning. It wasn't just what she said. It was how casual it sounded, how practiced, how free, as if she'd already mentally packed up his things and moved on to the next phase of her curated life. I remembered the first time I caught her lying. I was 14. She told my dad I skipped school, which wasn't true. I was homesick. I heard her on the phone later, laughing with a friend about how it's better he doesn't think the kid's an angel. I never told him. I should have. But I thought he needed someone even if she wasn't good. Over the years, she perfected her role. Publicly affectionate, privately cold. At every party, she held his arm like a trophy and called him my rock. At home, she took trips alone, blamed him for being boring, and talked to me like I was an unpaid intern. He never pushed back. Maybe he thought that was what second chances looked like, mutual tolerance. I stepped outside the ICU wing and stood by the vending machines. My hands were shaking. I thought about going back in and telling her exactly what I thought. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I opened my phone and scrolled through the last few photos I had of Dad, most of them years old. In every single one, he looked like he was trying. Smiling in that quiet, small way he had when he was proud, but didn't want to make a big deal out of it. The last photo was from my college graduation. He was in a wrinkled suit jacket holding a bouquet of sunflowers. Susan was off to the side, already turned away. I wiped my eyes quickly and walked back toward the waiting area. I didn't know how long Dad had, but I knew this. I wasn't letting her rewrite the story. Not now. Not ever. The hallway felt colder than before, or maybe I was just more aware of how empty everything was. I stepped back into his room, gently shutting the door behind me, like I was sealing us into a space where only truth could exist. The monitor still beeped in its calm, mechanical rhythm, indifferent to everything unraveling around it. I moved closer, took the seat next to his bed, and reached for his hand. It was warm, but still. He didn't stir. Hey, Dad, I said, softly. My voice caught a little. I don't know if you can hear me. They say maybe you can. And honestly, I need to believe you can. I paused, looking at the IV line in his arm, the faint bruises forming near the tape. I need to tell you something. And I should have said it years ago. I looked at his face, eyes closed, breathing shallow. But still here. I hated you for marrying her, I said. I know that sounds awful. I was just a kid. But I felt like I lost you the second she walked in. I swallowed hard. Mom had only been gone 2 years. I was still sleeping with the lights on. And then Susan showed up and smiled, like we were all in some Hallmark movie. I didn't know how to compete with her. I didn't know how to tell you I was still scared, still grieving, still needing you. I rubbed the back of his hand with my thumb, surprised at how steady I sounded. So I pulled away. I left. I stayed gone. And the worst part is, I made that easy for you. I made it okay for us to be strangers. My throat tightened. But that was my choice too, not just yours. I see that now. I looked around the room at sterile walls and humming machines. Everything about this place felt like it didn't belong to us. And yet, this moment, it did. It was ours. You remember when you taught me how to fish? I smiled. You were so bad at it. We sat there for 4 hours and caught nothing, but you still told me I had great instincts. You made me feel like a champion just for holding the rod right. I leaned back in the chair, the vinyl squeaking beneath me. Or that night, you stayed up with me when I had food poisoning in college. I was so sick, I couldn't stand. You didn't say much, just sat on the bathroom floor with a wet towel for my forehead. You never left. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting those memories settle. Not perfect, not dramatic, but real, solid. The kind of love that doesn't need big declarations to prove it exists. I was wrong, Dad, I whispered. I let one chapter define the whole story. And I'm sorry. Silence hung in the room, heavy, but not unbearable. I didn't expect a miracle, not in that moment, but I needed to say the words out loud. Not for closure, for clarity, for reconnection. I rested my head near his arm, letting my hand stay wrapped in his. Somewhere beyond the machines and distant voices in the hallway, I imagined he could hear me. Maybe even forgive me. Maybe that's all we ever really want from the people who raised us and the ones we lost along the way. To know we can come back. To know we're still welcome. I stayed there a long time. Not talking anymore. Just being near him. Just breathing. Just remembering the quiet man who never needed to be the loudest in the room to be the strongest one in it. The soft knock on the door barely pulled me out of the silence. I looked up to find Dr. Lung standing just outside his eyes, steady, but not cold. I nodded, and he stepped in. He didn't sit. That alone told me what I needed to know. Claire, he began, voice low. We got the preliminary test back on the potential donor. He's a match, but we still need final clearance before we can proceed. It's not guaranteed. I held my breath, afraid to ask. He continued. Your father's vitals have begun to drop. His body is under more strain than it can handle. We're talking hours, not days. I blinked. It was like hearing that someone had turned off the sun. We're still doing everything we can, he added gently. But you should be prepared. Prepared. As if I hadn't already been in a constant state of preparing for the worst since the moment the hospital called. I nodded slowly, unsure what my face was doing. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I just looked back at Dad and thought, what else can I say to you before time runs out? After Dr. Lung left, I opened my phone for the first time in hours. I needed to text Ethan. Ask if he was okay, if he was still moving forward. I didn't even get that far. The first thing that popped up was a photo. Susan, in a sun hat, smiling into the camera like she'd just won a game show. The caption read, "Self-care isn't selfish tag, island vibes blessed." I froze. My brain had to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. It was a poolside photo, a drink with a tiny umbrella in the corner of the frame. Comments below ranged from jealous to, "You deserve it, Queen." I stared at it like it might transform into something else. Something less grotesque. Less real. I tapped over to her story videos of brunch of palm trees, swaying of a boutique with linen dresses. I checked the timestamp. Posted less than an hour ago. While I sat with her dying husband. While the doctor told me we had hours left. While I held the hand of the man who made her life possible. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. There are some betrayals that aren't loud. They're not made of screaming or violence. They're quiet like the sound of a door clicking shut. Final. Unapologetic. I lowered my phone and looked back at Dad. He'd given this woman everything. Every ounce of patience, of trust, of care. He married her when the grief was still raw, trying to piece a life together. He built a home with her. Let her into our photos, our holidays. And this was how she honored him. For the first time in days, I felt completely alone. Not just emotionally, existentially. Like the floor beneath me had dropped away, and I was falling through nothing. I thought about calling someone, but there was no one to call. I'd been gone too long from every friendship that used to feel close. Work people were just that work. My world had narrowed into this hospital room, and now even that felt stripped of safety. I sat down again, looked at him. "You married a stranger," I whispered, "and I let you, because I didn't want to fight anymore. But you deserved better." My voice cracked. "I don't know if I can fix any of this. I don't even know if you'll wake up. But if you do, I swear I'll tell you everything. The truth, the good and the bad. I'll tell you about the photo I kept, about how I wanted to hate you but couldn't, about how much I missed having a father even when I pretended I didn't." I pressed my forehead to the back of his hand. "Just stay a little longer," I whispered. "Please." Outside, the sun was beginning to set. The light filtered through the blinds in slatted lines across the floor, soft and golden. I thought of all the sunsets he must have watched without me, and all the ones I never thought I'd get to see with him again. I needed air. Real air. I slipped out of the ICU wing, letting the doors whisper shut behind me. The hallway was mostly empty quiet in that eerie way hospitals get right before night shift kicks in. I passed the nurses' station and made my way to the end of the corridor, where the family lounge opened up to a small outdoor terrace. The moment I stepped outside, I felt that strange sensation of being between two worlds. Inside, everything was sterile, hushed, barely holding together. Out here, the world was still spinning. The sky was turning lavender. Somewhere, a bird chirped. Someone was alive enough to play music from their car across the street. I sat on the edge of a wooden bench, elbows on my knees, and stared at nothing. The ache behind my eyes hadn't gone away in days. I thought about my dad's hands, how they looked smaller, now thinner, like time was folding him into itself. I was about to head back in when I saw someone across the courtyard standing still in front of the hospital bulletin board. A tall man, late 30s, maybe wearing a denim jacket with frayed cuffs. He wasn't reading the notices, he was staring at a photo. My father's photo. One of those little framed pieces hospitals sometimes put up to honor longtime donors. It was a shot I didn't even know they had a candid, of Dad handing a check to the children's wing back in 2015, smiling that small, sideways smile he always gave when someone tried to make a fuss. The man had one hand on his hip, the other holding something, keys maybe. I almost walked away. I didn't want to talk, but something about the way he stood still focused made me pause. I stepped closer. "You knew him?" I asked, quieter than I meant to. The man turned. His eyes were pale green and tired, in the way that people who've lived through too much often look. "Thomas Carter," he said. "Yeah, I've been trying to find him." My chest tightened. He's in the ICU, I said. "It's not good." He nodded slowly. "Processing. I figured it might be bad. I only heard recently he was sick." "I'm Claire," I added. "His daughter." Something shifted in his face. He looked surprised. Then a strange softness settled there, like an old memory brushing up against the present. "I'm Ethan." He offered his hand and I took it. It was calloused and warm. "I've been trying to meet your father for a long time," he said. "I don't think he even knows who I am." Why, I asked. "What brought you here?" He took a breath, then glanced back at the photo like it was anchoring him to this moment. 7 years ago, my son got sick. Real sick. We didn't have insurance. We tried everything: fundraisers, second mortgages, GoFundMes. But we were still short. His voice caught a little, and he paused to gather himself. Then one day, I got a call. The hospital said a donor had come through, covered the rest of the bill anonymously. They wouldn't tell me who. Just that it was someone local. My heart began to thud. I knew where this was going. "It saved him," Ethan continued. "The treatment. The specialists, it worked. He's 9 now, plays baseball, draws dinosaurs. He's the reason I breathe." He looked directly at me. "I found out it was your dad a few months ago. I started asking questions, connecting dots. When I heard he was here, I came straight away. I didn't realize I was crying until I tasted salt." I shook my head in disbelief. "He never told anyone. Not even me." "I believe that," Ethan said. "Some people give like that. Quietly. No parade." We stood there in the fading light, two strangers tethered by the same man's quiet goodness. "I'm glad you found him," I whispered. Even if it's this late." Ethan nodded. "I just wanted to say thank you. I owed him that." "He's got AB negative blood," I said, suddenly the words tumbling out. "It's rare. We've been looking for a match for days. I'm not one. Neither is his wife." Ethan blinked. "I'm AB negative." I stared at him. "You're kidding." "No," he said slowly. "I signed up as a donor after what happened with my son. Figured it was the least I could do." I didn't speak. Couldn't. My lungs felt too full, my legs weak. The world tilted on its axis and righted itself in the same breath. "Come with me," I said. "Please." Ethan nodded, and together we walked back inside. The hospital halls felt different now. Still fluorescent, still quiet, but no longer bleak. There was movement inside me again, like someone had cracked open a window and let air into a room I'd sealed off years ago. I led him to the nurse's station and quickly explained, voice almost tripping over itself with urgency. The nurse on duty, Rebecca, I think stiffened with focus the moment I mentioned the blood type. "AB negative," she repeated. "And he's willing to be tested." "Yes." Ethan said, calm and solid beside me. "I'm already a registered donor." "Come with me," she said, already picking up a clipboard. "We'll do a full compatibility panel. Stat." As she led Ethan away, I sat down on one of those cold blue plastic chairs in the waiting area. I didn't move. I didn't breathe too deeply. I just stared at my hands and tried to hold on. I kept waiting for something to go wrong, for a tech to run out and say there'd been a mistake, for Ethan to come back and say he'd changed his mind. But nothing happened except time inching forward. 20 minutes passed, then 30. I didn't check my phone. I didn't text anyone. I couldn't bear to let the moment leak out into the world and dissolve. When Rebecca returned, her face gave it away before she opened her mouth. "He's a match," she said. "We're moving forward." For a second, I didn't process it. I blinked at her like she'd spoken in a different language. Then my body folded forward like a wave crashing on itself. I covered my face and sobbed, not the quiet tears I'd been holding back for days. This was something deeper, older. A lifetime of fear and shame and regret erupting at once. Rebecca placed a hand gently on my shoulder, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I cried until my throat hurt, until I could breathe again, until hope didn't feel like a betrayal of logic anymore. When I finally looked up, Ethan was standing a few feet away, an IV line already taped to his arm. "They're prepping your dad," he said quietly. "It'll be quick. The team here's solid." "Thank you," I managed my voice raw. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to," he replied. "Just let him keep living." I walked with him as far as the swinging doors would allow. Then I watched them disappear down the corridor, 2 nurses flanking either side. My heart thudded in a rhythm that felt unfamiliar, like it didn't belong to grief anymore. I turned and paced the hallway. I passed by the wall where his photo still hung, and for a moment I pressed my fingers against the glass. My father always behind the scenes, always giving quietly, asking for nothing in return. And now, even unconscious, his kindness had circled back to save him. The blood of someone he helped would now run through him. It was poetic in a way that didn't feel cheesy. It felt earned. Back in the waiting room, I dropped into the same chair I'd sat in 100 times this week and exhaled. I wasn't foolish enough to think this solved everything. He was still fragile. There were still risks. But for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like I was walking toward a door that only opened one way. I let myself imagine waking up tomorrow and hearing the words, "He's stabilizing." I let myself picture my dad's eyes opening, confused but alive. I let myself believe in the impossible, and not just because of the medicine, because of the man in the denim jacket, because sometimes kindness echoes. The hours that followed moved both too fast and painfully slow. They wheeled Ethan and Dad into separate bays behind frosted glass doors. I wasn't allowed inside, but I paced just outside the line, catching glimpses of scrubs in motion, sterile gloves flashing under bright overhead lights, nurses calling for bags, beeping monitors speaking their secret language. I pressed my hands together so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I didn't pray, not in the way I'd been taught as a kid. But I did close my eyes and whisper into the space where I hoped something greater might be listening. I said, "Thank you for Ethan." I asked for more time. I asked for just one more sunrise. The waiting brought back a memory I hadn't touched in years. I was 10, sitting on a different bench in a different hospital. My mom was behind those doors, too. Back then, Dad sat beside me, his hand over mine, both of us pretending not to be scared. I remember him whispering, "Whatever happens, you've got me." I think I started believing in safety that day. And I think I stopped the day he married Susan. Eventually, someone came to get me. A young nurse whose name I didn't catch led me back to Dad's room. He was there. Pale, thinner than before, but breathing evenly. A fresh IV line ran into his arm, and the transfusion bag above him was half empty. I stood there for a moment, afraid to touch anything to break the spell. He's responding well, the nurse said. We'll monitor him closely over the next few hours, but so far it's promising. My throat closed up again. Thank you, I managed, for everything. She smiled, then slipped out, leaving us alone. I pulled the chair up to his side and sat down, my legs finally giving out from underneath me. I watched the numbers on the monitor rise slowly, steadily. Every beep felt like a miracle. You did it, Dad, I whispered. You made it through. Again, my fingers brushed lightly over the edge of the blanket, careful not to disturb the wires and tubes. I sat there, memorizing the curve of his hand, the familiar creases in his forehead, the slight flutter of his eyelids every few minutes. He didn't wake up, not yet, but the heaviness that had clung to him all week was beginning to lift. I could feel it in the room like a fog clearing. Around midnight, there was a soft knock on the door. Ethan stepped in, wearing a clean hospital tee and looking a little paler than before, but steady. He carried a small bottle of apple juice and one of those dry hospital muffins. I smiled at the sight. I wasn't sure if you'd still be up, he said. No way I could sleep, I replied. Not after everything. I stood up and pulled him into a hug without thinking. Thank you, I said again. There aren't enough words. There don't need to be, he replied. I just did what he would have done. We both looked at Dad. He's the reason my son's alive, Ethan said. When I found out it was him, I couldn't not try. He leaned against the wall, eyes soft. People like your dad don't come around often. He gave without ever needing credit. He didn't need to be a hero, he just was. I sank back into the chair. I spent so long being angry at him, I admitted. I wasted years. And now you're here now, Ethan said. And so is he. That's what counts. I looked at Ethan's face in the dim light. I could see the fatigue in his posture, but also something else piece. Was your son scared? I asked suddenly. When he was sick, Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor. Terrified, he said. He was 6. Didn't understand half of what was happening. But when the bills stopped coming, when the treatment started working, it was like watching the sun come up after a storm. That's what your father gave us. We sat in the quiet together for a while. No phones, no noise. Just the sound of Dad breathing, of machines clicking forward of time, finally moving in the right direction. At some point, a nurse peeked in to check vitals. Everything stable. I caught myself smiling. Not a big smile. Just enough to feel like I was still alive. Like the world hadn't ended after all. Ethan stood to leave. You'll call me if anything changes, he asked. I nodded. Of course. He paused at the door. You're lucky, Claire. Not everyone gets a second chance to say thank you. I looked at my father again, this quiet man with the strong heart. I know, I whispered. I won't waste it. The room had quieted. The machines hummed steadily now like a lullaby written in blips and beeps. I hadn't slept, not really. I must have dozed off in the chair beside him, curled up in the position that hurt my spine, but kept me close. It was early morning, I knew, from the way the shadows shifted from the faint smell of hospital coffee wafting down the hallway. Then I heard it. A shift, a rustle of sheets, and then his voice. Hoarse. Soft. Claire. My eyes flew open. His head had turned slightly toward me. His eyes were still half-lidded, unfocused, but they were open. Alive. Dad. I breathed. I stood too quickly and nearly tripped over the IV pole trying to reach his side. I took his hand gently, afraid he'd slip away again. You're awake. You're here. He blinked slowly, as if the act required more strength than he had. It hurts, he said. His lips cracked at the corners. I reached for the small cup of water on the tray and helped him sip it through a straw. I know. You had a transfusion. There were complications. But you're stable now. You made it. He nodded slightly, then closed his eyes as though the effort of staying present was a battle. I watched him breathe shallow but steady. After a while, his voice floated up again, a low whisper. I heard things he said. I frowned. Dreams. He shook his head ever so slightly. Voices. There was a long pause. Susan's voice. I sat back down slowly, my heart thudding. What did you hear? His eyes opened again this time, more focused. There was a dull pain behind them, but also something else clarity. She said I was going to die, that she hoped I would, that it wouldn't matter. I didn't answer right away. I looked down at our joined hands. The skin on the back of his was papery and thin, the veins like rivers beneath it. I wanted to lie, to spare him, but I couldn't. She said it, I finally whispered. She said worse. I didn't want you to hear it. He didn't move, just blinked, slowly, digesting that. The silence between us filled with a quiet sorrow. I knew, he murmured. Some part of me always knew. Then why? The question left my lips before I could stop it. Why did you stay with her after Mom? After everything? He turned his head toward the ceiling as though the answer might be hiding in the tiles. Because I was lonely. Because I thought you hated me. Because she was there. My eyes burned. I didn't hate you. I was just lost, angry, grieving. He looked at me, then really looked. You came back. Of course I did. A small, tired smile crossed his lips. You saved me. I shook my head. No, not me. Someone else. He frowned faintly. Who his name is Ethan? He came to the hospital, said you once paid for his son's surgery anonymously. Years ago. When no one else would. He blinked surprised. He never forgot I said. And when he saw your photo, he recognized you. Turned out he has the same rare blood type. He was a match. He didn't even hesitate. Dad's lips trembled. Not with weakness this time, but with something else. Emotion. He saved your life, Dad, because once you saved his family. He closed his eyes and let out a shaky breath. A tear slid down the side of his cheek, disappearing into the pillow. Good man, he said quietly. Good heart. Like you, I said. He didn't answer. But I saw the answer in the way his hand squeezed mine just a little tighter. I stayed like that for a while, his hand in mine. Our silence full of things that didn't need to be said anymore. The days that followed felt like waking up slowly from a long, cold sleep. Dad's recovery wasn't immediate, but it was steady. Every morning brought a little more color back to his face, a little more strength in his voice. He started asking for food again. He joked with the nurses. He even watched baseball on the tiny hospital TV, grumbling about the Yankees like nothing had changed. But something had. He asked to speak with Susan 3 days after waking. I was in the room when she arrived, wearing sunglasses indoors and perfume far too strong for a hospital. She smiled brightly when she walked in, her voice syrupy. Oh, Thomas, you gave us such a scare. He didn't smile back. He didn't even look at her the way he used to. Can we have a moment? He asked the nurse. Then he turned to me. You stay. Susan faltered for a second, but still sat down in the visitor's chair with practiced grace. I know things were tense, she began, but I never stopped believing you'd make it. Dad looked at her, tired but clear. I heard what you said, Susan. I wasn't unconscious the whole time. She blinked. What do you mean outside this room? In the hallway? On your phone? Telling people I was as good as gone? Booking a trip? Laughing? Her mouth opened, then shut. Thomas, He raised his hand gently, and she fell silent. You don't have to explain. I'm not angry, just done. She stiffened. What does that mean? It means the house is yours to stay in if you want it. But I won't be paying for your trips, your bills, your lifestyle anymore. You made your choice, Susan. And now I'm making mine. Her composure cracked. You can't be serious. After everything, I'm entirely serious. His voice was calm, not cruel. You chose your truth. Now I choose mine. She looked at me then, as if I might step in. I didn't. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak. Just picked up her purse, adjusted her sunglasses, and walked out. No tears, no scene, just silence. When the door clicked shut behind her, Dad let out a long breath. That he said was overdue. I sat beside him again. I'm proud of you. He gave me a faint smile. I used to think forgiveness was weakness. Turns out, holding on to the wrong people is. After he was discharged, we didn't go home. Not right away. He asked if I'd take some time off work. Let's go somewhere, he said. Just us. So we did. We flew to Oregon, rented a car, and drove along the coast. We stopped in small towns, ate too much seafood, took long walks by the cliffs. He showed me where he used to camp as a teenager. I showed him my favorite bookstore from college. We talked. Really talked. One night, in a little motel room overlooking the water, I asked him, "Do you regret marrying her?" He thought for a long time. I regret not seeing you were still grieving, that I didn't wait longer, that I let my guilt become distance. I could have called more, I said, or visited. I was so caught up in being mad, I forgot how to be your daughter. He reached for my hand. We lost years, but not everything. We have this. That night, we watched the sunset from the back of the car, wrapped in blankets. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I belonged in the world again. Months passed, and Dad grew stronger. He retired officially with no fanfare, just a simple email and a quiet lunch with a few old colleagues. He said he wanted to spend what time he had left living, not chasing numbers. We still traveled, not always far sometimes, just to the next town over to try a new diner or catch a community play. The space between us had filled not just with time, but with a kind of gentle peace. One morning, while we were sitting on the porch of a cabin we'd rented in the mountains, he turned to me and said, "You should start that foundation." I blinked. What foundation? The one you used to talk about. Helping people with rare blood types. In your mom's name. I hadn't even realized he remembered. But he did. And a month later, the paperwork was filed. We called it the Margaret Rose Fund. Our mission to support Rare Blood Type Registries Fund, emergency donations, and raise awareness. Ethan signed on as our first volunteer partner. He said it felt right to give back in the same way someone once gave to him. Watching him speak at our launch event with his son in the audience, clapping the loudest, felt like the world had circled back and tied its threads neatly. Susan didn't come. I hadn't seen her since the hospital. But one afternoon, a small envelope arrived at our office. No return address. Inside was a handwritten letter. Her writing was neat, deliberate. She apologized. She said she had started working at a local grocery store and was learning what it meant to earn something again. She said she missed who she used to be before she let comfort turn to cruelty. There was no request for money, no plea for contact, just the words, "I'm sorry," for everything. I read it twice, then folded it gently and placed it in my desk drawer. I didn't write back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I kept it. That felt like enough for now. On the first anniversary of Dad's surgery, we visited Mom's grave. The sky was the kind of blue that looked like it had been scrubbed clean. I brought daisies, her favorite. I knelt beside her headstone, brushed away a few leaves, and whispered, "I finally understand love. Not the kind that shouts or demands, but the quiet kind. The kind that forgives, that stays, that lets go when it's time and holds on when it matters. The kind that builds things, foundations, friendships, futures." Later that night back home, I sat by the window with a journal I'd started keeping again. The pages were half full now. I opened to a clean one and began to write, "Sometimes love comes softly. Not with fireworks or grand gestures, but with a second chance to say what matters. I used to think closure meant walking away. Now I think it means showing up again and again for the people who matter. My father did that. Ethan did that. And maybe one day I'll do it too for someone else. Or maybe quietly I already have." The pen paused. I looked out at the garden Dad had started growing again. Tomatoes, peppers, basil, simple things. But they were alive, just like us. If you're listening to this and you're the one sitting outside an ICU or trying to piece yourself back together after someone left, please hear this. You're not broken beyond repair. You're not too late. You're not alone. So many of us carry invisible grief. Some of us are mourning people still alive. Some are learning to forgive parents who weren't ready to be parents. And some, like me, are learning that love doesn't always knock loud. It sometimes whispers, "I'm still here," even after the world goes quiet. Lately, I've seen more people stepping away from chaos, taking walks, planting things, starting journals again, choosing silence over performance, forgiveness over fury. That too is healing. That too is strength. If this story found you in a hard moment, I hope it reminded you that second chances are real, that miracles come in ordinary clothes, and that love, even the quiet kind, can change everything. If you felt seen today, if this made you breathe a little deeper, consider subscribing. Not for me, for you. So the next time life gets heavy, you'll have stories waiting that remind you you're still allowed to hope. Drop your stories in the comments. You never know who needs to hear them.